Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to Aspire by I Have the Right To. I'm Katie Shipp, Executive Director of I Have the Right To.
And I'm Chessy Prout, co-founder of I Have the Right To. We're so glad you're here with us for another important conversation.
Today, we will be talking with Erica Thompson, Assistant Head of School for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at St. Patrick's Episcopal Day School. With over 25 years of experience in education and a master's in curriculum and design, Erica has dedicated her career to creating spaces where students can learn about respect, identity, and belonging. Erica has developed a powerful workshop that uses hair, something personal, public, and ever-changing, as an entry point to talk about boundaries and consent. Through stories, children's literature, music, and art, she helps students connect everyday experiences with the larger conversations about respect and equity.
We're also thrilled to welcome one of her students, Annalise. Annalise is a 7th grader at St. Patrick's Episcopal Day School in Washington, D.C. She's an avid soccer player, enjoys acting and singing, and has been a member of the Black Student Affinity Group since kindergarten. Annalise is a talented public speaker, having reached the finals of her school's annual recitation contest, and she's one of Mrs. Thompson's advisees. We're so excited to welcome them to share how these conversations are changing the way young people understand boundaries, identity, and the importance of consent. Erica and Annalise, welcome to Aspire.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
We are so excited to have this conversation with you today. Erica, I had the pleasure of getting to talk with you, I don't know, maybe a few months ago at this point, about some consent programming we were hoping to do together. And when you shared about this workshop, I thought, oh my gosh, we have to talk about this on the podcast. So thank you for being here and bringing one of your students with you. I know that you've been in education and equity work for over 25 years. I'd love to know what first drew you to focusing on boundaries, consent, and equity through something as specific but universal as hair.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been doing this work in independent schools specifically for a long time, where Black students tend to be the minority in the schools that I've worked in. And I would say every year I've had either a student reach out to me or a parent reach out to me and tell me about a challenge that they were having around students touching their hair, asking lots of questions about their hair, and it making them feel uncomfortable and needing some help with how to deal with that. And so I developed this presentation to talk to students, but I go in and I don't just jump right into boundaries. We, do a lot of discussion around hair and how important our hair is to us, and how, hair, they're always surprised. They think, you're going to talk to us about hair for 30 minutes? And then they get really involved in the discussion because I think everybody has it, or even if you don't, we talk about that. But this idea that it is really public and personal, I think, is really interesting. It's very public because we see it. It's so visible, but it's really personal because it's attached to you, and it is often really tied up in your identity. And so I think as we start talking about that, the students get, pretty deep into it as the understanding that, wow, hair is really public and really personal. And then I think the fact that it changes makes it interesting as well. So you may look one way one day and then another the next. And so that adds to the discussion, the interest in the hair, and then the desire to want to touch it.
It's so interesting hearing your definition or how you describe hair as public, personal, and changeable. It almost reminds me of, the language that we use when we talk about consent. But before we get into that, I was wondering, can you share how these sort of 3 specific dimensions play out in real life, particularly in the school setting? Why do you think hair is such a powerful entry point, or why did you choose hair as this powerful entry point for conversations around boundaries and consent, especially with the younger students you work with?
Yeah, I've usually started with about second grade students. And so we start, and I talk about some of the history of hair. And we talk about how over the years, hair has been sort of a form of protest. And I'll show pictures of like men in the 60s who grew their hair long because they were told they couldn't, or women who wore big afros because they were told their hair should be straight. And so they picked it out as big as they could. So, like, using this, hair as a form of telling a story. There's some really interesting. They study American Indians in second grade, and there's a lot of sort of rites of passage that happen through hair, cutting of hair. How they wear their hair could tell you if someone was married or not, or if they had been in a war or not. So there's lots going on with hair as far as identity. And then everybody has kind of a story of a haircut. I tell the story of my daughter cutting off her ponytail when she was about 5 years old. And I asked her why she did it. And she said, "You didn't tell me not to." And, and I remember being so devastated about her ponytail being gone and having to like really check myself, like, it's hair. It's going to grow back. She's okay. She didn't lose a limb. And when I tell that story, everybody raises their hand. Everybody has a story about, a hair cutting story, the time my brother cut off my hair, or I tried to do my own bangs, or so everybody generally has a story to tell. And so that's sort of getting everybody involved in the conversation. Before we even get to boundaries and consent, we're just talking about, this interesting idea of hair. I think about walking down the CVS aisle, how many products there are for your hair. And there's like two full aisles between the shampoo, the conditioner, the barrettes, and so everybody can talk about that. And then we talk about different hairstyles, and they like to name them: a mohawk, a buzz cut, a ponytail, a bun, a bob. And so we'll do some of that. Again, we're getting really comfortable around this topic of hair. We talk about Madam C.J. Walker, who was the first Black millionaire, and she became a millionaire by selling hair care products and for women, and that's how she was able to make money. So like hair care is such a business, and so we'll talk a little bit about that, and some students will have a story about that. That haircuts can often be a rite of passage. So sometimes that first haircut, a lot of people will have a picture from their first haircut, or parents keep a lock of hair from that first haircut. So all of a sudden, the students start to think, wow, hair does have a little bit more significance than I thought about at the beginning of this conversation. And then we kind of transition into, now let's talk about some boundaries around hair. And one of the things that I do is I show that if you were to go to Amazon and look, there are about 6 books with titles either "Don't Touch My Hair," "Please Don't Touch My Hair," that are all there. And I show pictures, the covers of those books. And I start to ask the students, what do they notice about those books? And if you look at them, all of them have women of color pictured on the front. And there's even a song by Solange, who is Beyonce's sister. And she has a song, and it's called "Don't Touch My Hair." And I play the first verse of it, and it's "Don't touch my hair, my soul lives there." And so we talk a little bit about that. So what do you notice? And so we then start to talk about that. Why do you think that is? That so many people have written a book called "Don't Touch My Hair." All of these women of color have written this book. And usually I'll have a student say, like, all of those cool hairstyles, like the braids, and sometimes they put beads in them. And so there's this idea that there's a real interest and a curiosity about Black women's hair, I think, particularly. And so that's where we start, like, okay, curiosity is a normal and great thing. But now what you do with that curiosity is what we have to now talk about, right? And so then I usually, I show I have a pillow. Have you ever seen those pillows that have like sequins on them? And if you rub the pillow one way, it's purple. And if you rub it the other way, they're silver. And we'll talk about how interesting that pillow is. And it was kind of designed with the idea that you want to go touch it. Well, they also put that same kind of a design on a t-shirt sometimes. And so do you still have that same desire to want to go and rub the sequins and, make it turn silver or turn purple or whatever it is? But what's the difference now? And then we talk about the fact that they're wearing that t-shirt on their body. And can you just walk up to someone's stomach and rub it? without talking to them. And so that kind of gets into our idea of consent. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how might you ask them if you want to rub that T-shirt, and what might they say? Because they might say yes, and they might say no, and and that's okay. And we talk a little bit about body language. What if you were to start reaching and you could see them cringe? Like, what does that mean? And so we talk about, sort of, sometimes somebody might not be saying no, but everything about them is, is saying no. And so thinking about that. And then kind of the big final thing is I show this video, and this really brings it home for the students. And it's a video of a woman who is interviewing a wrestler. So she's a Black woman, and she's interviewing a wrestler about his match coming up. And it's on live television. And she's asking him, oh, how do you, get inspired to really go after your opponent? And out of nowhere, he says, you can tell, what does he say?
Can I touch your hair? It looks soft.
Yes.
And then just grabs her hair.
And he grabs her hair. And then he turns to the audience and says, oh, it is soft. And that is her real hair, ladies and gentlemen. And you can tell that she feels really awkward. And even when he said, can I touch her hair? He leans in, and she kind of leans in too. And so some students have said, well, she leaned in, and so it's okay. And so we'll talk about, does she really feel comfortable? She was on live television. Do you feel like, she felt like she had to lean in and let him touch it? Did she have the right to tell him no in that moment? And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then he told the audience it was soft and it was hers. Was that his story to tell? What if it wasn't her hair? What if it wasn't soft? Was that his story to tell? And the kids can get pretty, fired up listening to that. They realize that is not okay when they watch that video. And so that leads us to, just a really good conversation around, not only boundaries, not only consent, but also, this idea that like, oh, as long as he's complimenting her, is it okay to touch somebody? Because that is sometimes when I've, said to a student, please don't touch another student's hair, they're like, but I love her hair. It's so pretty. So does that make it okay? As long as you're saying nice things, you're allowed to touch somebody without their consent, which, can lead to all kinds of things later on. So I think it's such a great second, third grade level entry into this conversation that can then continue as they get older and, the boundaries get a little touchier. Yeah.
It's such a perfect example of how easy it actually can be to talk to kids about consent and boundaries. And I think that, people think, oh, that's something I shouldn't talk to my kids about until they're in high school, right? And I always say, no, you need to start having these conversations so early because kids get it. And especially when you explain it to them in that way. And I think sometimes kids get it better than adults get it, right? Your students are watching that video and they're saying, okay, no, this isn't okay. But how many people in the audience watched it and probably thought that it was just fine or laughed or whatever, and it's just so interesting to think about it. And also so important to realize that young students really can understand this. And if we start to have this conversation, they'll start to think about it in other parts of their lives as well. So Annalise, I'd love to hear from you. I know you joined this conversation today because you've heard Miss Thompson talk about it at school. I'd love to hear how it made you feel whenever you had this conversation, anything that stood out to you or surprised you with what you thought whenever you were listening to it and participating in the conversation, or even your peers.
I think it was really important to hear because a lot of people, like you said, don't really get it. And then when they're older, it's it's different. They think they're excused from it or something. So I think it was really cool to learn about it at such a young age. And then learning about hair too. That was just really fun. We made hair things. And yeah, I think boundaries you should teach people throughout their lives. So they don't forget it and it sticks, and they continue to learn and as boundaries grow and stuff like that. So I think it's really cool and important.
Did you feel like after you had that conversation, did you feel like you were empowered more maybe to tell people what your boundaries were, to say, please don't do that? Do you think it helped you?
Yeah, totally. I think it helped me and like other people to realize that it's okay to say no and like to not feel bad for like saying you can't do that, because it's like you're right. It's not their right to say I should be able to touch you.
Yeah, one of the things that stuck out to me when you were describing that video, and I haven't seen it, and I'll definitely have to watch it, but also is power dynamics. So, the fact that she's on live television, she's interviewing, was it a famous wrestler? Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
A famous wrestler. She's in front of all these people. So when you said that she leaned in, I was just thinking about what would I have done in that situation. And it happens so quick. You feel awkward. All these people are looking at you. You're trying to get this interview with a famous person. And so it's not like an equal power dynamic, right? And so I think that's something that is so important to talk about with kids as well. And I know I have a 4-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son, and I know that's something that I talk to them about. Like, even if it's an adult, for example, in this situation, if an adult is asking you to touch your hair, you also have the right to say to them, even though they might be in a position of power, right? You have the right to say to them, please don't do that. And so that was something that kind of came up whenever you were talking about that video as well. And I wonder if that ever came up in your classes or your conversations.
I think they were, I don't think they knew the word power dynamic, but they definitely realized, right, that they were like she was just doing her job. She was at work. They were not. And so she was probably very aware that, like, this is my job. I could get fired if I get angry on air and tell him, don't do that and stop. And so that was definitely a conversation that we had. Yeah. So.
It seems like you guys are talking about a lot of different like light bulb moments that happened during this presentation with the students. And I have a kind of a two-pronged question for the both of you. That sequin analogy or the sequin pillow story that you told was a light bulb moment for me in our conversation. I think that's so applicable that just because something looks one way doesn't mean that it's the same in both situations. Like that you can brush a pillow, but if the sequins are on a human body, then that's totally different. That there's no one size fits all, that everything is kind of in conversation with each other. But in the classroom, and when you were experiencing this presentation for the first time, Annalise, was there anything that really, was there something specific that really stuck out to you that you remember to this day? And then for you, Erica, is there something that you notice students kind of realize as like an aha moment to translate to their everyday lives?
Yeah, like I remember watching it and I like remember the pillow thing because I had a shirt just like that and I like loved it. But then there was like people who would like, there were some people who would like walk up and do it, and then teachers would be like, don't do that, you have to like ask them. And there would be some people who would like ask, and I would always be like, well, I don't want to be mean and be like, you can't do this, but then you can. So I think it like really was like, oh, I can say no, and that's like okay. It's not like a bad thing to refuse.
I know we talked about that. You said sometimes it's some of your good friends that ask about like touching your hair, and so it's it's one thing, it's a stranger, but it's some of your good friends that do it, so you have to kind of have that conversation with them. I know she mentioned one friend who's also a person of color. It may be, even then it feels different than if it's a white student, so because she also has curly hair. And when I've given this presentation with adults, I've often had somebody come up to me and say, my child has really curly hair and we experience this as well, right? And so it's definitely people, finding their way into the conversation in different ways. Yeah.
I think that's such an important realization to have, and one that I think I had way too late, is that saying no is not a bad thing, that it's not something that will hurt another person more than not saying no would hurt yourself. And I think it can be discouraged in kids sometimes. Like, they call it a tantrum if you're like a little kid. No, I don't want to get dressed. No, I don't want to wear a jacket. No, I don't want to go to church. That was my little sister's fight when we were growing up. She was like, no, I don't want to go to Sunday school. But I think it's so important to let ourselves say no. And then on the flip side, from the perspective of your friends, it's so important to condition people to be okay with hearing no, that no isn't like such a horrible thing. And I know that we've got programming at I Have the Right To that talks about hearing and saying no. And that was probably one of the most like life-changing workshops that I think we could have, at least that would have been in my life. Because, I think especially as young women, we're sometimes, told to be respectful and play with the rules of improv, which is yes and, but that's not always the healthiest thing to do. So I'm really encouraged to hear you, Annalise, say that that is something that you took from this presentation. And I think every young person could benefit from learning that. And you're at such an advantage learning that at such a young age. So I'm really proud of that with you. And yeah, this work. I was wondering as well, how have these conversations changed the way that you and your friends talk in school, not just about hair, but has it affected the way that you guys talk or treat each other? And do you see ways that it could change the way that you talk to each other and treat each other?
It totally changed the way we thought about stuff. Not necessarily like right in second grade, but like as we get older, we would think about like consent and those things more like in depth, and we would be like, there's more than like one side of the story. Like there's different perspectives and there's different ways to think about it, and it like totally changed our conversations and made them way deeper and like stronger. And I think that was really helpful to us, because a lot of times there's like right or yes and no, or right or wrong, but there's like, it's not just like that. It's like there's certain situations, and it was really helpful.
Something that came up for me when I was listening to you talk, Erica, is when you were talking about hair and how it plays into so much about life. I also was thinking about hair in terms of like gender expectations and the boxes that we put ourselves in, or other people put ourselves in, based on how we present. Girls are often expected to wear their hair one way and boys are expected to wear their hair another way. My son has always, for the last, 3 or 4 years, he's always had his hair long. He has blonde, curly hair. And right before third grade, he decided he wanted to cut it all off. And I was like, okay. And I try really hard with hair, and like kids don't have a lot of control over most things in their lives. But when it comes to hair, I really try to have them like be able to pick how they want their hair. Well, shortly after my son cut his hair, my daughter said, "Mom, I want you to shave my head." And I had that same moment of like, okay, like I'm going to take my daughter to get her hair shaved, like, am I going to do this? Like, am I really going to stick to what I've been saying, And I said, Emmy, think about it for a couple of days. And if you still want to do it, then we'll talk about it. And she hasn't brought it up since. But I really thought about it. I really, really thought about it. And I was like, you know what? If she wants to do it, I'm going to take her to do it, And so, it was that moment of really like, oh, wow, like that's, whereas with my son, I wouldn't have thought anything of it. And so this isn't really like necessarily, about the workshop that you're doing specifically, but I wonder if there's like a room to, as the kids get older, start to talk about those expectations too, and how expectations based on your gender can be harmful in ways, whether you're a, male identifying, female identifying, anywhere on the spectrum, it can be, we put so much pressure on it, and how hair actually plays a part in that as well. So I almost wonder, like, could it be a part 2, in 6th grade, coming back to hair, and what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, no, I think that is so true. And we do talk a lot about gender identity and gender expectations here at the school. And I think hair plays a big role. And I do see that changing so much. I look at things like, just like an NBA game from 1970s and an NBA game from now, and the hairdo of the men has expanded so much, and like there was a time when that just wouldn't have happened, right? And so I think that might be a cool way to look at it, to see like there is no one way for men to wear their hair, where I think that was. And so, yeah. And what does that mean? But you're right. That idea of like, would you really have let your daughter do that? And that would have been sort of a hard mom moment, I think. But it sounds like she was like kind of trying to claim something in that moment. And I do think our hair is a way to do that. And we have some control, and there it is. It's really visible. So I think that's interesting. We do talk a little bit. I mentioned about the sort of, the stereotypes of hair, but we also talk a little bit about when might it make sense to have a rule about hair. And so one of the things we talk about is in the military, because they do often mention the buzz cut. So why do you think in the military they have that rule of cutting their hair short like that? The women have to either have their hair short or in a bun. But we can talk about, is there safety involved in that? Is it about when you're out in the field and maybe you might get lice or bugs or something in your hair, right? And so when does it make sense to have some rules around your hair and how you wear it? And when is it just some control being sort of exerted, right? And so we do talk a little bit about that in the presentation. And I think a lot of that control is around keeping those boxes on things like gender, right? And having different rules for men and women. And, I think about our dress code, which used to be very gendered, and now it's much more generic. Like students need to do A, B, and C as opposed to, what girls wore and what boys wore. And then there's also, there's the Crown Act, which is a rule that was just passed in the last 5 years. And it's because there were so many cases of people being fired from their job or not being promoted around their lack of, and I'm doing air quotes, professionalism because of the way that they wore their hair. So again, this idea that there's a way that is right for your hair is a big conversation we've had. So the Crown Act has been a big deal, and I've got a lot of headlines from people, somebody not being allowed to participate in their graduation because the dress code for boys was that they had to have hair of a certain length, or, the wrestler whose locks were cut off because the rule was that they couldn't participate with and so we have a lot of different headlines where students were, pulled out of an activity or not allowed to participate around hair. And so, and I think a lot of that is to try to put these boxes around what is a proper professional hairdo for a man and what is a proper professional hairdo for a woman, and who's making these decisions, right? Who is deciding what is right?
And how beautiful it is to give students the ability to think critically. I mean, that's everything you're saying, like where they can stop and they can think, is this fair? What are the reasons behind it? What are the problematic reasons behind it? How am I going to respond? Who are the people that can support me? And for them to get to start those conversations so young is really inspiring for me.
It is. It's fascinating. Like, I've obviously gone down a hair deep dive, but as I think about it, there's so many. I kind of looked at my own hair journey once and put up pictures of myself at different stages of my life, and you really see, and you hear about people sort of doing a big chop after a big event in their life, or those kind of things. So we really do kind of express ourselves through our hair, maybe more than we realize. And so I think the students always leave like, wow, okay, there's a lot happening here, right?
Now, Annalise, I'd be so interested to hear what your perspective is on people your age, other students your age, whether it be outside of St. Patrick's or in the area, or even in the world at large, because I know we're all so connected these days. Do you get the sense that this is something that most people your age understand, or is it something that you think could be worked on with people your age, like the conversations around consent and also being able to challenge certain rules that exist based on bias or discrimination? Like, are these conversations that you would feel comfortable having with a classmate from another school, or around, in a school around the country?
I think as technology and online talking and things you get to see online, as it gets bigger and more accessible, I think more and more people start to understand the problems that we face, and I think that has made it really easier to talk about, and it made people understand, specifically in my generation. I have a lot of like there's a lot of people older than me who are like, what, you get to like look at this at this age, I didn't. And I think that can be unhelpful, but then at the same time that can be really helpful because you get to see things and like problems that people would think, oh, you shouldn't talk to people this age about because they're too young, when sometimes it's not like that. You need to talk about it with people that young because that's when they really understand. Like what you said about kids really like needing to learn it. I think kids, it really sticks with kids when they're younger because they don't have all these other outside factors coming in. Like they have what's right and what's wrong. Like they're taught, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. So you have to teach like the most important things at such a young age because then it really, really sticks. And I think that's just so helpful.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned the social media, because my immediate thought when you asked her that question was that, kids, I'm guessing maybe a kid in Nebraska, this would not ever occur to them, right? So I think, you've been at St. Patrick's all your life. I think we're having these conversations, but I'm guessing that maybe at some schools they're not. But I do think that probably social media is probably pushing some information to people that they might not get otherwise. So that's a good point.
It's such a good reminder, too, that there are pros to social media, because I think a lot of times adults think like social media is just dangerous. Keep everybody off of it, including like children and adults. But there is a benefit to it, right? You can have community and you can learn things that maybe you wouldn't get to learn in your own community. So my son, he's 8. And the one day I told him I was going to talk to high school students about consent. And because of the work that I do, my kids have been talking about consent and hearing about consent before they could even talk. And he said, Mommy, just tell them, if somebody doesn't want to hug you, they don't have to hug you. And like, you should just ask them, do they want a hug? It's really not that hard. And so, Annalise, I would love to hear if you were going to go into a classroom with Miss Thompson and explain to second or third graders, now that you're older and you've had these conversations, how would you explain to like a second or third grader or younger what consent is or what boundaries are? Do you feel like you have like a way, or even if you were talking to one of your friends at lunchtime and they didn't know what it was, maybe a friend that doesn't go to your school, how would you describe what consent or boundaries are or why it's important?
I think if I was talking to someone younger, I'd be like, consent is like you allowing someone to touch you or like to do something that affects you. But if I was talking to someone older, I think I would go more in depth. Like I would give like examples that like affected them. And I think if I was talking to someone younger, I would be more like, you have to give consent and like there's nothing around it, because as you get older there's like more things that add into it that could like maybe change your like idea about it a bit, so you have to like be like right and wrong. But like when you're older, you already might have like experience with certain things, so you might also have opinions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think it's, you kind of talk about it maybe when you're younger in more simple terms so that when you're older you can understand it in more complicated ways. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. It's interesting you said the hug thing, because I was even thinking sometimes I've had parents tell their child, go hug Miss Thompson, and I can see that their child does not want to hug me. And so even, that idea that like, okay, I think a fist bump would be great. I will, try to redirect the conversation. So I often will tell, parents that like, don't force your child to give me a hug. We're good. So, yeah.
And sometimes adults don't understand that. That is definitely a rule in my house, like no forced affection. And there are some adults that it takes them a minute. But I always say, like, you can ask, you can say, can I have a hug, a high five, a fist bump, a thumbs up? Like, there's other ways of showing, like, respect or whatever the word is, right? But, like, you're never required to give physical affection ever. And sometimes we have to get the adults on board because sometimes the adults aren't quite there yet. So we have to have the conversations of why we're doing that. So Erica, I'd love to hear any advice that you would have for teachers or parents about how to have these conversations, whether they start, the entry point where you start with students or in other ways. So, teachers, parents, how educators can model this in their classroom.
Yeah, I think, the biggest thing would be, don't think about sort of the end, like, sexual violence and things like that. We are talking about just a child having a right to their body and their space and their bubble and, those boundaries. So I think, get comfortable with that idea that children need to just be in charge of their own space, and however you can get into that conversation, what that looks like for their space. If it's, when you're sitting on the rug and each person pretends to have a bubble around them, and why that's important. And, for some kids, it's really important. Kids have different, sensory issues and needs. And then get them comfortable with that language of, oh, sorry, I'm in your space. May I be in your space? And allowing for the yeses and the nos. And so I think, realizing that is just, you can't, they can't be too young to do that, right? And so I think being able to get comfortable with that kind of a conversation and teach words like boundaries, teach words like consent early on, and in age appropriate ways, obviously.
That's amazing, and something that I think we need more of in the world at large. I think it's so important to be having these conversations, not just between, the adults and administrators, but also with the students. And so being able to speak with both of you today has been so helpful. And Annalise, I was wondering if you had any advice for students or peers or anybody really, because we can all take advice from anybody of any ages, but speaking up can be hard. Saying no can be hard. Setting boundaries can be hard. Is there anything that helps you feel confident in your voice to set a boundary in your life?
I would just say, remember that you can say no. And even if you think you might sound mean, it's better to sound mean and even if you do hurt someone's feelings, just apologize. Be like, I'm sorry if that was harsh, but it's okay to be harsh if they're going into your boundaries or pushing them and not respecting you, because everyone deserves respect. So I would just say to remember that.
You just gave me goosebumps. That was yes to that, exactly.
I would love to hear what you think, Erica, as well, about what gives you the confidence to use your voice and to do these hard conversations with kids and do these conversations that make such a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, I think when I see change happening, it excites me, and it's really great when you hear, students will say to me, I never thought about that. Thank you so much. Or, behaviors can change. And I think it also gives, I think just giving students the language sometimes to say what's on their mind. And if you have the right language, it doesn't have to be harsh, it's just no, stop. Maybe it can be please stop because you're invading my boundary. Is that reminder that, I don't want you touching me, but it's just not, stop touching me, which is okay too. But I think, the more language they have to understand their feelings, to be able to express their feelings, the better. And it's, we can't do it too early. So.
And it's so true that it really does take practice, and it can feel silly at times, but you really do have to start saying it out loud. Otherwise, it becomes hard in the moment. So I think it's really great to practice saying no. And it's something that my sisters and I do together all the time. We'll practice saying, no, I love you, and I need this right now, or I can't handle being squeezed right now. And knowing that it comes from a place of love, I think has helped all of us in our lives too, in dealing with friends and strangers and people in the world.
We just had a program at Academy of Our Lady of Peace out in San Diego, and the author of Sexism and Sensibility, Joanne Finkelstein, was there and did a keynote, and I highly recommend her book. It's really good. But she talks about people pleasing and how girls and young women are really pressured to be, amenable, to, go along, to be kind, but almost kindness to a fault, where we're not sharing what our boundaries are. And I feel like that's something that I've had to work through on really being these are my boundaries and I'm going to say them. And so to me, it's something I don't want for my children, and especially my daughter, because I think she'll have more pressure to be that way than, my son. And just getting comfortable, like you said, Chessy, like it takes practice, like getting comfortable saying like, please don't do that. And then if somebody doesn't listen, being willing to, like you said, Annalise, like even if it is a little harsh, to be like, listen, you didn't listen to me. This is my boundary and I'm not going to move on this. And so I remember there was an adult in our lives who loves my children dearly. And my daughter said, no, I don't want to give you a hug. That's my body boundary. And they said, oh, you're going to make me cry. And like, they love my child. Like they were not at all doing it to be mean or anything like that. And I just looked at them and I said, how would you feel if she goes away to college and somebody tries to use that same tactic on her? Mm-hmm. And he kind of had a moment of like, oh my gosh, like I shouldn't say that. And I was like, exactly. We need to teach her now that if he's going to cry because you don't give him a hug, that's on him, honey. That's not on you. Like,
that's right.
Right. And just kind of reminding our kids and the adults in the same conversation. And, the adult got it. He got it right away. And he was like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so it's just interesting. I'm so constantly so inspired by young people. And I really think that young people like you, Annalise, are going to make this world a safer, better place. I really do believe that with everything in me. And that's why I do the work that I do, because young people inspire me every single day. So as we start to wrap up, I'd like for you to both just take a minute and imagine a future where every student grows up understanding consent from an early age. Every student understands what their boundaries are and how to like recognize and respect the boundaries of others. And so imagine what that future would look like. And I'd love to hear, what does that world look like for you? So when kids grow up with that education and with that empowerment, what might the world look like in 20 years when you all are running the world and we are not?
I think the world would be like such a better place. Like a lot of bad things that happen right now are due to consent. Like even if it's to an extent, it's all because of that. And I think if everyone were to understand that, it would be such a different place. It would be so much better. People would feel more accepted. They wouldn't feel like they are, like you said, pressured, especially girls, into like doing or saying certain things or like acting a certain way. I just think it would just be a totally better place. People would be able to like be themselves and to like not have to like pretend to be someone else because they're scared of what other people think.
Yeah, I'm imagining healthy relationships, a lot more belonging, because the other part of the whole like kind of touching thing is the othering of someone, right? And so and like to take that off the table. So I think, just much healthier relationships, more equal relationships, where everybody feels a little bit more on equal footing. And I think that part about not having to feel like you're changing yourself.
It's really powerful to hear that and to be able to share that, or to hear your shared vision for what a world could look like. Because I hope we can get there someday. That would be really nice. But in the meantime, I think if we all keep acting as if it is like that, I'd like to say that there's only so much activism that you can do on a grand scale when the real difference really happens in the way that we can touch emotionally, mentally other people in our day-to-day lives. So I just spent the entire podcast just imagining you both as pebbles, like being dropped into a pool of water, and just the effect that you both have had, and at least that you will have in your life as you continue through the path that you choose to be on, is going to be so incredible. So I'm really grateful for both of you. And to end our podcasts, we like to have our guests think about the phrase, and I have the right to, which is what our organization is called, and something that really helped me try to claim my own rights to my voice and my boundaries and respect, and is a kind of phrase that we use to help envision a world where consent is the culture. So if I could ask you both to share what your I have the right to phrases could be, that would be wonderful.
I would probably say I have the right to set boundaries, refuse people like overstepping my boundaries. I have the right to be respected and feel respected. I have the right to have consent, and yeah.
Okay. I would say I have the right to teach students, even very young ones, about boundaries, consent, and hope it carries with them through their lives.
I have like goosebumps all over my body. This has been such a great conversation. It's really been a fun episode. I feel like we could talk for hours more. Annalise, when you get older and you're running the world, remember your first podcast with us, with Chessy and me. You know, you can, and Miss Thompson, you can look back and say, all those years ago. But thank you both so much for sharing your voices with us today. Erica, your perspective as an educator is so powerful, and it's clear how much intention and care you bring to creating spaces where students can feel respected and can also learn.
And to you, Annalise, as well. Thank you so much for your honesty and courage. Hearing directly from students is always such a gift. It reminds us why these conversations matter so much and how the next generation is really leading the way.
And for our listeners, we hope today's conversation sparks reflection about how we can all respect boundaries, celebrate identity, and create communities rooted in consent and care. And remember, you have the right to. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about workshops and programming available for students, educators, parents, and community members at ihavetherightto.org.